Hi everyone, thank you for being there. You're probably wondering why is there a gum bichromate print on it for a oil printing demonstration. Well, I've been interested in alternative imaging pretty much all my life, and this was done pretty much 50 years ago when I first started getting a bit fed up with normal black and white photography. And you can see on the right is the contact print from basically a whole plate monorail De Vere camera that I had at that time. And I thought, well, that's a really nice sharp picture, but can I do something else with it? And remembering in those days there was no Google, so you couldn't really just type it in and think gum print, and I had to sort of try and find all the old books and look into the process, and I came across this gum printing process. And this is actually one of the most successful prints that I made. Very similar process to oil printing, except you use gum arabic, still use dichromate, but you're using watercolor ink instead of oil-based ink. And I thought you might like to see this as one of my early prints from 50 years ago. Next slide, please, Austin. I also looked at other alternative processes, and graphic arts was sort of using silkscreen and photography. And this was, I went to a workshop at one of the local colleges, and this was one of the, I say, my favorite silkscreen prints. And it's just basically from a 120 black and white neg. You can see the original picture on your right, just a snow scene. And so that's really just a silkscreen print with white watercolor ink. Again, best part of 50 years ago. So next, please, Austin. So this is my journey into what I call the oily experience. And in the last few years, I've managed to do 3 exhibitions now of my oil prints, and I couldn't think of anything else to call it but moments in time. And literally they're pictures that I've taken over my lifetime, mainly on black and white film. And so I'll introduce you how I've done it with my oily work. So next, please. I was lucky I managed to retire finally in 2015, and being a photographer all of my life, I thought, well, what I can do a bit more learning now, and I wanted to go to all these workshops. And I looked again, looking through Google, you can find all sorts of workshops, and there are platinum, cyanotype, salt, antitype, Polaroid lifting, photogravure. But what I will say is that if you want pure photographic continuous tone, then platinum is still the way forward. I mean, it's such an incredible process, but very expensive, and it's really quite a difficult process. So I tried all these with the exception of Bromoil, because basically I couldn't find a Bromoil workshop, which was a bit frustrating. The advantages of, well, they're all very different processes. I didn't particularly like cyanotype because they were mostly blue, although I did have some success in toning the prints with tea and coffee and other substances. Salt prints, that's again a nice process, but very much a photographic process. Antitype using different plants. Polaroid lifting, I mean, that's a lovely little process if you've ever tried it, but the pictures are so bloody tiny, aren't they? They're only as big as 3x3 at the most. So one of the, if you do want continuous tone, then photogravure again is a wonderful process, and pretty much on the same latitude really as platinum. But people say Bromoil can give continuous tone, but I have my doubts. So slip on, please, Austin. So what did I choose? I thought, well, I've got to try Bromoil somehow, and again through Google, I managed to find the Bromoil Circle of Great Britain, and I was introduced to Brian Idden, who's the secretary, and the inner circle members, and they managed to let me in, shall I say, at the Edinburgh meeting in 2018. And I'm not sure whether Kirk or Dave Simmons will join us, but my thanks really go to them and Liz Kemp, who have been a great help, really, on part of my journey. So next, please. I don't know whether you can all see that, but excuse me. What I found with my Bromoil experience is that the old super coated bromide papers were just not easily available. And I'm sure many of you know the same. The old inks, the members of the circle were very kind to me, and they gave me some old batches of paper, and they gave me some old ink, and pretty much it all looked a bit like this, where you get an old tin of graphic chemical stuff, and you might as well use tarmac out of the road, but it's that solid that it just didn't really work very well for me. And we seem to have a problem in getting the G&C chemicals in the UK. So I think you're probably better over in the USA, Austin, aren't you, for that? But what concerned me more than anything else was that the technique didn't really suit my style of imaging. And it's, as you know, a very pictorial type of medium. And another thing is that I'd been in dark rooms all of my life, and to be quite frank, I was a bit fed up with this new darkroom process. Unfortunately, I'd managed to get rid of all my darkroom stuff a few years ago, and then I thought, oh God, do I have to start having building a new darkroom? But I did actually manage to build my own darkroom at home, and then found, well, I'm still a bit fed up with using it. So, okay, next, please.
Sorry, just a second. There we go.
So these are my first Bromoils, and I think, to be fair, they're fairly typical, fairly pictorial, and I'm quite pleased with them. But I didn't really want to do all of my images in this manner, and I found that perhaps it's my technique, but they were all a bit sort of fuzzy wuzzy, really. And I thought, well, if I'm going to keep doing this process, then I've got to change something. And I thought, well, is it the materials that I've got, or is it the fact that I can't get the old, you can't buy the old material that works best, or do I just have to sort of keep trying with the Ilford fiber-based multigrade, which I think they call it Ilford Art 300, isn't it? Isn't that one of the papers that you can use recently? But, anyway, next, please. So I thought, well, I was a little bit fed up with using old paper that didn't really work very well. And I thought, well, can I make my own paper and coat it with a sensitive emulsion? And the answer was, well, yes, you can, but this essentially changes the whole process. So it's not really a true Bromoil. And yes, you can make it light sensitive without using, if you like, silver bromide paper. But you then use dichroma to sensitize it, and you're using gelatin and pure ink pigment. So you're really turning it into a completely different process. And interestingly, this then predates the Bromoil process. Then I found out, well, this is actually the Rawlins oil print process, which is much earlier than Bromoil, because really when Rawlins was creating this, and his colleagues, then bromide paper didn't exist. So this is well, I thought, well, off we go, let's try this. And next, please. But I think the reason I did all that was that I'd seen Kirk Toft's oil transfer prints in the box. And for those of you who don't know what the box is a set of prints that the Bromoil Circle of Great Britain send to you every couple of months or so that we can actually see real prints in real life. And Kirk is, I mean, really it ought to be Kirk that's doing this talk, because he's the absolute master of the oil process. And his transfer prints, I just still don't know how he does them, because they're absolutely magical. Problem I had was that there was no one in the UK that was really any great help in solving my oil printing problem. I just wanted it to be nice and simple, and so that I could repeat it as often as I wanted. And again, I did some Google research and found this guy in Poland called Radoslaw Brzoski, however you say that. And I'm not sure whether, is that the guy that you mentioned? Was it Renato that mentioned him? No, it was Ashok, wasn't it?
Yep.
No.
But
Not the
anyway,
same. No.
The Polish Czech, the Czech Republic national.
yes, he is.
Yes. I know him. Yeah.
I've just found this workshop with, well, I mean, we just call him Radek. That's his sort of common name. And I thought, right, well, I got to go to this. So next, please, Austin. And luckily, you know, I've got time on my hands, and I thought, right, I'm off to Poland, and got myself booked, and off we go. So next, please. And this is the guy. So I look ever so little next to him, but he's quite a big guy. And that Radek is the guy on the right with his wife. And this is in his studio in Gdansk. Yeah, that was an amazing experience. And you can see all of his prints here. They're pretty much all oil prints. Absolutely magic. So next, please. And this is how I was taught. I mean, we're going straight into a video of Radek doing his oil process. And we're using 10% gelatin on just good quality watercolor paper. You can see the important thing to note is that he's using a domestic sponge, and it should actually be a little bit more vigorous than that. If you can imagine using a typical Bromoil brush, then it's almost the same type of effect. You're dabbing the sponge. You don't use the flat of the sponge. You actually crunch it up a little bit and put ink on the sponge, and just dab away. And yeah, so you've not really quite got the action there. It is a bit more lively than that. But you're essentially getting pretty much a continuous tone image from this inking. The ink is, again, it's probably a very soft 1796 type of ink, and it comes basically in a jar. So it's not, I mean, I buy mine in tubes, but if you can just about see, it sort of comes in jars, and you just scoop a little bit out. Going to move on. This is quite an interesting slide, because this was a quote that I can't remember the year of the book, but it was in the History and Practice of Oil and Bromoil Printing, and there's some nice comments that you can read. You can't quite, I've got pictures on mine, but it's generally accepted that an oil print is far easier to print than the Bromoil. And some early books said that oil prints could not prove tonal range as great as a Bromoil. Well, I mean, I would almost disagree. And in particular, they mention Missant there, and basically quoting oil as being superior in several ways. So my friends in the Bromoil circle will be absolutely hateful of me for saying that, but that's my opinion. So this was my first oily, and that was what was done with a sponge dabber. And again, it's just a little bit too pictorial for me. I mean, that's a continuous tone negative. Well, it was originally a digital print, originated on a digital camera and then transferred to contact negative. Next, please, Austin. So I was sort of thinking, well, I quite like this process. I'm coating my own paper, I'm creating my own emulsion, and I can get the materials really very easily in the UK. And I was quite successful in getting what I felt were good quality images. And you can see, I think, well, it's a much simpler process. Well, it is in some ways. It's a fairly lengthy process, and I do it in a number of stages, but incredibly, I find that the results are still amazingly pretty much photographic, continuous tone, and that's something that I personally particularly wanted to achieve. Next, please. Please ask any questions. If you want me to explain any differently, or if you're unsure, then just shout out. So don't worry about being quiet there.
Richard, I've got a question. I've just started playing around with the oil process because my friend James Michelson is starting to do it as well. I'm used to using foam liquid emulsion and the process that Emil Schilt came up with, which significantly stiffens up the ink in his process developed. You're using the ink right as it comes out of the can, right? For this oil process? Okay. Because James gave me a few sheets of coated paper yesterday. So I think I'm going to try this, the technique that you're talking about here. I mean, I use sponges with my other process already. So I've got the ink, I've got the sponges, I've got the coated paper. So I think I'm going to try it out and see how it works.
I think that the only difference between the sponges and rollering and brushing is the type of creative effect that you want to achieve. I mean, I'm trying to achieve more of a photographic effect rather than a pictorial effect. And
the sponges allow you to do that. So
absolutely, yeah. But anyway, the advantages I found of the process is that it's a pretty green process because there are so few chemicals involved. I get a lot of pleasure from coating my own paper. I mean, it's so rewarding to coat a nice sheet of gelatin and it worked basically. Minimal chemicals. I mean, it's all done in pretty much room light, so you don't really need a dark room at all. And some of the time you get astonishing photographic results, and it always surprises me somewhat that such a ridiculously simple process can give me, if you like, such pleasurable quality results. And what is also very important to me is that it's incredibly permanent and archival, and that was really one of the reasons why I started looking into alternative imaging 50 years ago, because knowing how black and white prints and color prints fade in time, that this process can be regarded as an archival process, in the same way that things like platinum can. Next, please. It suits digital traditional film, so it really doesn't matter what equipment you use. You can originate your images on, dare I say, iPhone, on 35mm, on 10x8, large format, 120, anything. As long as you can make yourself a negative, then it's the world is at your command. transfers are possible. Kirk is the master on oil transfer. And I've done a couple that are pretty good, but Kirk is such a brilliant guy at that. You can do this on glass, and I've only tried this once, but you can probably just about make out that's an oil transfer on glass. So that's again, it's just the same emulsion, same gelatin, just coated on a sheet of very clean glass and sensitized in exactly the same way. And that gives a very interesting effect if you want to frame it, because you can put a background color card beneath it and you're immediately changing the color of the image almost. Again, one of the most important aspects of the it suits most photographic genres, so you can have almost any subject range, and the images will suit it. The blacks are absolutely incredible because I tend to only use high quality lithographic ink, and I think this is the one that I tend to use. It comes in a tube. It's just really like toothpaste, really thick toothpaste, but that's letterpress relief ink, carbon black. Very handy. I mean, that will last me probably a year, 2 years, and that's probably about £15 for a tube. When you think when you're doing platinum prints, 1 milliliter of platinum is about £10, so I can get that's almost the equivalent of 1 platinum print, and that'll last me a year. So it's just crazy when you think about it. As I said, you can print the images in many ways. You can either use a brayer roller, which is a thick rubber roller, a foam roller, a foam dabber, or the traditional Bromoil brushes, but I tend to use a high quality, very smooth 2-inch roller, which is just a typical paint roller, but I source they're really very fine, quite high quality foam rollers, and that gives me a lovely clean effect. So next, please. Well, there are some disadvantages. It's a fairly time-consuming and long-winded process, because you're obviously creating your own emulsion to start with, and it's just to quickly grab one, which I just happened to have made earlier. I mean, that's just a sheet of pre-gelatined watercolor paper. I use Buckingford 300-gram watercolor paper, and I'll show you how I do that in a moment, but it takes me about 2 hours to do about 6 of those, and so I tend to make up six gelatine prints in a session and then just leave them to dry. You have to remember that you need UV light to expose the print, not darkroom enlarger white light, and the process is only suitable for contact negatives, so you can't actually use, there doesn't seem to be the availability of enlargers with ultraviolet light source. I mean, if someone can build one economically, then that will be great. And my personal preference for this process is because it's a more photographic process than a pictorial and artistical process, and that's why I think I enjoy it the most. Tonal range, well, I always put a Stufa step wedge in, well, not always, but most of the time I will put a Stufa step wedge in on my exposed prints, and don't expect them to be as good as platinum, but you'll see from the prints anyway that they're pretty reasonable tonal range. Next, please. It's probably better in my experience. I mean, bear in mind, I've only been doing this for a couple of years, but it's better for low key subjects with plenty of black and mid tones rather than highlights. I've tried to do some highlight image or high key imaging, and it's a little bit more difficult, so I'm not quite there yet. And again, I said it's more bromide photographic than pictorial, but that's the way I want it. You can get a bromoil effect, however, if you use traditional bromoil brushing, but to be quite frank, I couldn't stand using bromoil brushes, so I just don't use them. And I do use very small ones to remove the ink, but that's about as much as I do at the moment. So. Right, the biggest disadvantage to me of the process, apart from the fact that the only chemical that's really involved is potassium dichromate, and that's really quite a nasty chemical. So you probably all know about the problems of potassium dichromate. Treat it carefully and you'll be fine. So I thought, well, I'd better put that in as a disadvantage because it is quite important. My biggest issue with oil printing is drying the print, and once I've made the emulsion, coated it, exposed it, the biggest problem is drying it. And I found that you can see I use glass quite a lot to keep the prints flat. Well, for some unknown reason, when I'm drying the print, then the print is such a wild animal that it will actually break the glass. And that's really quite an amazing feature of photographic print, is that it's got the strength to actually smash your glass in half. And I think it's probably the fact that in those three instances, I've tried to dry the print too quickly by using extra heat, or I've moved the print from a cooler room into a warm room, and it's dried too quickly. So you can see that the images are stuck down onto the glass to keep it flat, but I've then probably moved it into another area and it's just gone crazy on me, really. And that only happened, I mean, I've probably only had about 5 prints out of 200 do that. So it's not a big worry, but it's an important thing to bear in mind. So, okay, thanks, Austin. Right, so how do we do it? Well, the first stage, and this is the one that I said takes me about 2 hours to make 6 prints, is I make up my gelatin solution and I buy it just like this in a bag. You can see it just comes in a bag like that. It's just 250 bloom grade A domestic food gelatin, nothing special, it's nothing photographic, but it's supposed to be high quality, and it costs me about £18.99 was the last price. That's £18.99 for a kilogram, and I can make hundreds and hundreds of prints out of that. So really, it's peanuts. To make up the solution, I use 50 grams of gelatin, 25 ml of isopropyl alcohol. That just helps it dry out. So I think that helps the drying process. It's nothing really too important. And I make 500 mils in one go, and you see it just goes in a little brown jar like that. And I find it's best to try and use it within 1 month, because the longer you leave any gelatin, that if you leave it too long, then you can get fungi growing on it, just like you can on agar plates in science labs. Okay, next. Right, this is probably one of the most important steps of the process. So I've been telling you, you don't really need a dark room, you need a kitchen more than anything, because you can see I've got a microwave on the left, I've got a kettle there, and this is just a steel sheet of metal. What I've done is I've soaked the Bockingford watercolor paper for 5 minutes at room temperature, and I've then just squeegeed it fairly dry with taking the cold water off, boiled the kettle, and I'm just pouring boiling water over the sheet of paper. So that's just the ordinary sheet of paper, 300 gram And if you had the sound on this, you could actually hear the air bubbles coming off the paper. And what that scalding does, it takes the air out of the inner surface of the paper, and then when you pour the gelatin on, it prevents all any bubbles coming in onto the surface. So it's a little bit sort of jerky. Right, so now that's gone. Thanks. Next video, please, Austin. So we've scalded the paper, and what you see, the paper is obviously quite warm. The metal sheet is quite warm. You can see on the left, I've got the little jar of gelatin. I've got 60 mils there of gelatin, and that piece of paper is a little bit bigger than A4. So I'm drying off the sheet of paper. I'm getting most of the water off. The paper is beautifully flat on the metal sheet, and that is a magnet. So that's a magnet surround. And that enables me, when I pour the gelatin onto the paper, remember that gelatin's at 120, about 125 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's really quite liquid, it's nice and soft. I just pour it onto the sheet. It's on a very level, that little table is dead level, and you've got to make sure that you use a spirit level to level it out, zero it. So that basically means that your gelatin is just going to flow naturally by gravity wherever you pour it, basically. And I'm using a domestic comb or a small part of a comb just to bring the gelatin to the edge of the magnetic sheet. And you can see me just pulling the gelatin into the edges, and the gelatin doesn't go any further than the edge of this sheet. So you get a nice even layer of gelatin throughout the whole sheet.
And did you say 125 mils?
No, 60 mils.
60 mils.
And, at 125 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh,
And
and how do you warm it up?
In a microwave.
Mm.
So it's 1 minute, 30 seconds to start with, and give it a little shake, and then another 1 minute to get it to 125. And so precisely the times for that amount.
That's great.
So you don't need a water bath, just pinch your wife's microwave. Right, so that's now, see the gelatin is setting very quickly, and you've only got about 1 minute to you've got to keep it flat for 1 minute, otherwise if you start moving it about, gelatin will flow. So the next stage is, if you can imagine, we've now left that sheet for about 10 minutes. I mean, in the meantime, I'm doing another sheet, so I've got to move that very carefully to another flat area. And what we do now is, I should come with a little paper knife. So I'm scoring down the edge of the magnet. These magnetic sheets are what you get on the side of cars. You know, you can get an advertisement on the side of a car. So you just buy it in a roll and then cut the middle out. And I find that works better than strips of magnet. So I now peel the magnet off very carefully. I like the jerky bits, Austin. It works quite well. And so you can just about see that the area where the gelatin is. So it's sort of, it won't fall off now. It's going to stay there quite well as long as you don't heat it up again. So I take the metal sheet away. The metal sheet's for the magnet, by the way. That just keeps the magnet flat. So this is an A3 size sheet of glass, any old glass. And the important thing is to put a mylar sheet on the glass, and that stops the paper sticking to it. So I'm then laying it flat, and again, this is a laborious bit, which I hate doing, but by taping the paper down on the glass, then it's just water on the sticky tape, and wipe the water off. And then obviously you've got to do the 4 edges. Now, once
And-
you've done that,
Do you have 6 metal plates and 6 of those magnets so that each
I've-
sheet has its own
no,
plate?
you can. I've got about 4 of each. I mean, you don't need a lot. I find you need quite a lot of sheets of glass because you've got various stages of the print in process. So you've got some with dichroma on, some are already inked. You'll again, it should be a bit clearer in a moment. So if you can imagine that now has got to go and dry, so it needs 2 days to dry, and then that's what it looks like when it's dry. So it's still got the tape around it, but you know, you can rub it, do what you like with it. It's not sensitive to light, and it's a lovely surface. I don't know whether you can see any. Beautiful surface, and that's, you know, it's almost as good as Kodak could do, I would say.
And you don't have problems with curling at this stage?
No, this prevents it.
Mhm.
I think that's the end of that
Mhm.
video. Right, so you've seen, well, the picture of that's the sheet of glass which you've just seen the image on earlier on. So again, you just coat it in a similar way, and on the left you can see my homemade storage cupboard for all my sheets of gelatin. And that's all. I mean, I just create however many I want, and if you know, I don't always fill it up, but the one with on the left with the cover on is for when you sensitize it with the dichroma, then it's best not to leave the sensitive sheets in room light or any light. So I've got a little door there which shields them and protects them from being exposed. And I say the sheets they'll last for several months uncoated. So next stage is to make up the dichromate. This is the nasty stuff, and the solution itself is a 5% potassium. Important to add the acetone. I think that I'm not really sure what the acetone does, but it just helps the surface to dry. And I make up 500 ml stock solution, and it just lasts months and months and months. So I mean, it's such an inexpensive process that, I mean, it doesn't go off. It really doesn't. So next, please. Right, this is how it's a bit darker because
Sorry.
we're in, if you can imagine, we're now in room light. So this is the stage where we don't want ultraviolet light or daylight. And you can see on the left that I've got 10 ml, or I've got a little can with dichromate in, and I'm drawing off 10 mils. So I usually do a couple of, what I tend to do at home is that I'll do 2 prints in a night. So I'll coat 2 sheets, 10 mils goes on the one sheet. And all we do is use a very cheap brush. I mean, this is a couple of quid brush from the range, which we have over here. It's a nice smooth brush, it's a nylon brush, and I'm just brushing the dichroma onto the gelatin emulsion. It goes on absolutely cleanly, very smooth, very even, and the next print on your left will be a 9 mil, because when you only use 10 mil with a dry brush and 9 mil of dichromate on a wet brush. It takes about 30 seconds to a minute to coat the surface, so you're not messing about with rods. It just works extremely well and very easy to do. you can tell when the coating is finished, because the actual, you feel a little bit of resistance at the end of the brush. So then it's really sufficient. But as long as you've been brushing it backwards and forwards and diagonally for about a minute at the most, then that's absolutely perfect. You should really be wearing gloves, I might add, but so that's.
I was wondering about that.
But it's I'm very careful that I don't get any on the skin anyway. There's lots of debates about it at the moment, but so there we have it. So that's the sheet of glass that's been coated with dichromate, just the same amount. You don't need to alter it. And I now, when I mentioned before that when they're coated, I put them in that little box with the door on so that they don't get fogged. But I find it's best to leave them for at least 3 hours to dry naturally. And I always expose them on the same day that I've coated them, because after 12 hours, then you start to lose your sensitivity, and then it's not such a reliable process. So I'll coat in the morning and then perhaps expose them later in the afternoon. So just one back to that very quickly, Austin, if you wouldn't mind. That machine there is just a dryer, and what I found, I'm not really sure whether it does work or not, but if I've only allowed a couple of hours for the dichromate solution to dry, then I will put it in a print dryer for 30 seconds or a minute at high temperature, just to warm that dichromate up and make sure the surface is dry. Because if you don't make sure it's completely dry and then you put your negative on top, then your negative might stick to the surface of the gelatin, and then that'll knacker it up completely. It'll knacker your negative and your emulsion. So I find that, I think they call that super drying, or I think Kurt calls it some superheating, and I just do it, not really sure whether I need to or not, but it works. So next, please. Disadvantage of the process is that you can only expose under ultraviolet light. Nearly all of my prints that I've done over the last couple of years have been done with a facial sun lamp. So it's really a domestic sun lamp that you can buy local, in your local store. And the only problem I found with that is that you need a slightly longer exposure with the facial sun lamp than this device that I've got here. I managed to pick this up secondhand, and I told Austin the other day it's actually from an undertaker that they were using for memorials, and they were printing the beloved names on the memorial stones, and I managed to pick that up very cheaply. So that's just an ultraviolet light source, contact printing, and then we're ready for. I generally expose with this for about 100 seconds for an average negative. Right, so I'm just mentioning there that once you've exposed your print, then I always continue on to the inking stage. I don't, like some practitioners in Bromoil, leave it and do it another day. I will wash the exposed print, minimum of, 2 hours at 20 degrees C. I've reduced that to 1 hour now because I managed to pick up an archival print washer, which is just an ordinary black and white print washer. So the aim of the washing is to get rid of the dichromate solution. But next, please, Austin. So you can now imagine that there is the exposed print. You can see you've got an image there. It's no good being all yellow, so that's the purpose of the wash, is to get rid of all the dichromate yellow staining. And that's my first wash system, which 2 hours, 20 degrees C, cold water. It doesn't have to be heated. and I've just got them face down with some sponges on them just to keep them under the water, and so that will then get rid of all the dichromate. So we're then pretty much ready. You've gone from the nice yellow print to a clear one, and the next stage is the gelatine swelling wash, which is, well, 10 minutes at 25 degrees. So it goes from cold water to hot water quite dramatically, and what that does, it creates your matrix for the inking. The next, you can see that that's at 26.4 degrees. Next, if you would. I have tried leaving the print and sort of coming, and I've washed all the dichromate off, and I found that it's actually best to keep the print damp rather than let it dry out completely, because I think if you're not going to ink it straight away, then if you dry it completely, it's going to start curling and cause you all sorts of problems. So I've always inked straight away after the exposure. It's important that you tape it down with the mylar sheet. The mylar sheet really is quite an important feature, and once again, when you've inked it, you've got to make sure that you keep it taped down for at least a week and don't touch it, because the ink for some reason takes ages and ages to dry, and keep it, well, you can store it somewhere safe in a cool room. So next, please. So we've got the nice clean matrix on your left. It's been in the hot water wash. Well, it's not really a wash, it's just a soaking. So the print, there's no movement of water. It's just soaked at quite high temperature. You mustn't exceed 30 degrees centigrade, because then you'll find that your gelatin will start to melt anyway. So keep it within the maximum of 30 degrees. At this stage, you can see you'll get a nice three-dimensional effect. You should be able to see your picture in texture, and the gelatin is actually quite strong and robust at this stage, but just be careful you don't use a sharp instrument on it. You've got a picture on the right of what I call my inking studio, which is just our conservatory at home. And I'm going to just show you either one or two inkings, if you would please, Austin. You can see the ink there. I've laid some of the ink out, and with a spatula, got my rollers on the left, and you should have a picture appear in a moment. Right, so we've laid the damp and, well, wet print down on some sheets of domestic kitchen roll, and the aim now is to get rid of most of the water on the surface of the print. So I'm just dabbing it quite well. I won't say carefully, you can actually be quite rough at this stage, but just don't drag it across, otherwise you might damage it. So I'm getting rid of all the surplus water. We then take away the sheet that's beneath it, and I'm going to dab the water off the glass and lay it down ready for inking. As I said, you could actually store this picture in that stage for a week, but I would prefer it not to dry out completely, so I would try and keep it damp. It will still work as long as you then reheat it and re-swell the gelatin, but I always go straight into inking from this process. I've squeezed about ½ an inch of my ink. Again, run it about. So again, that's just about ½ an inch squeezed out the tube, rolled it out, You probably quicken it up a bit if you want, Austin. And I'm going to be fairly vigorous on the inking. And you know pretty much straight away whether your print has worked, because you should pretty much see the image start to come straight away. You can, I'm not sure whether I've got a stoof or step wedge on that one, but you can also check whether you've got your exposure right for the negative on there. You can see the step wedge. You need to make sure you're covering the whole surface area, because obviously if you don't ink your step wedge, then it's not going to work at all. So, and I've got two rollers. One, the one that I'm calling inking with at the moment is called the ink roller, and then the one on the far left top corner is the no ink roller. And if I feel that I've got too much ink on the print, then I just use a clean roller to remove ink. This is obviously done in daylight, so there's, you know, again, no dark room involved. You just need to have a good light situation to judge the density of your picture. There you go. That's pretty much it. So that's finished.
The blacks are unreal compared to Bromoil.
If I can't ink a print in 5 minutes, then I give up. Really, you know, I couldn't cope with the bromoiling it for 3 hours and 4 hours and coming back and re-soaking it. And if it doesn't work with me, then there's just another print if you want to have a quick look. But yeah. The actual videos are a little bit smoother, but the file is such an enormous file, isn't it, Austin? So we're not really getting the resolution and the
Yeah.
But I think you get the idea of how it works anyway. You can probably just saw then that the surface of the print looks a little bit matte and soft, but once that's dried, you get the most beautiful luster surface of the gelatin. You can see it looks a little bit flat there, but when it's dry, I mean, I'm just amazed how the gelatin surface evolves really in time. So as you can see, I'm completely addicted to this, and I've just got a few prints if you want to have a quick look. This was done many years ago. Oh, well, the one on the left was done, that's a 35mm neg. The one on the left's a 120 neg from 40 odd years ago. The one on the right is a digital origination, fairly recently, a couple of years ago. And the left one's a digital image from Hasselblad X1D. And the one on the right is an old 35mm neg from an old Leica from many years ago.
And you said that you were shooting digital, but then you've since returned to film.
Well, the camera on the left, that was a pretty expensive Hasselblad X1D camera, and the chip failed on me, and I also had, when I retired, I sort of spent all my retirement money on a Leica, had an Leica M9, fantastic camera. And then within well, only probably about 18 months ago, the images started to go a bit strange, and it was like having a spider's web on the image when I saw it on the screen after I'd taken the picture. And fell out with Leica a bit, because I then found out that the M9 camera was, the whole series of M9 cameras were created or built with Kodak chips that were defective, and I didn't find out that the replacement program for M9s had expired about 18 months ago, and I didn't qualify for a repair. So the camera itself was very little used, cost me about £5,000, which is, and when I took it down to Leica in London, probably only a few months ago, they said, "Very sorry, sir, there's nothing we can do. It's going to be a very expensive paperweight for you." And I thought, thank you very much. And crazy as it sounds, at the same time, I started having a defect with my Hasselblad digital camera, which again, very expensive camera. And my images started to go completely green. And I thought, right, oh gosh, I've lost my Leica. I mean, the Hasselblad was a great camera to use as a digital camera, but luckily, when I contacted them, even though it was out of warranty, they said, send it back. And they actually couriered it back to Sweden, completely repaired it free of charge, and I got it back. But then I thought, well, I'm a bit cheesed off with digital equipment. I sold it, and I've started buying up old film cameras, and I've now bought Rolleiflex. I've got the Fuji 617 and gone completely back to film. So if you just go to the last slide, that's an old 35mm picture that I did many years ago, probably on an old 35mm Nikon. In real, I mean, these pictures don't really justify the quality of the oil print, because they're on just iPhone snaps of the print. And when you see the print, you think, why does this process work so well? And, how on earth do you get this quality for such a ridiculously simple process? And when you think Kodak have developed their emulsions over decades, this is just watercolor paper, gelatin, and black ink. You can see why I'm absolutely obsessed by it. And just, this is a last print that was on an iPhone, would you believe? So it doesn't really matter what you use, it's just how you treat it. But that's what I call a stick insect, which is just a leaf on frozen. Yep. Well, just to draw it all together, I don't mind how I originate the pictures, as long as I can get archival quality and the high quality black and white. Then it's not the end result that matters, it's just how you obtain it, I think. So, just a couple of quick ones. Again, Austin, thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Is that it?
Nope.
Oh, yeah. I mean, how do I do it? Well, speaks for itself, really. I scan all my negs with a FlexTight X5 scanner. I print my internegs on a Canon 300 inkjet printer. You don't have to buy the expensive inkjet film to print your negative. Permajet's a little bit more expensive, but I use PPD inkjet film, which is about 40p an A4 sheet. If I want to use normal prints, I can use I've got a big Epson roll printer, and just use their fine art paper, hot press or cold press, and sorry to say, Apple Macs for image management, Austin. So might be one more slide, but what do I want to do for the future? Well, I need to try and get different coloured oilies. I must get Kirk to show me how to perfect the transfer process. I still love gum bichromate, but I think it's a lot more difficult than the oil process. And I'd love to do limited edition oil prints, and hopefully in the future more exhibitions. And you can just see that was one of my exhibitions that I did earlier in the year. So that's it. Hope you've enjoyed it.
That's
I
awesome.
don't know how we've done for time, but pretty much.
Yeah, so does anybody have any questions they want to throw out to Richard? That was a ton of information.
Shout out.
Question about the watercolor paper. Is that just pure cotton or is it buffered? Does it matter?
I don't think it matters. You can use, I started off using, is it Hahnemühle Platinum Rag?
Yeah.
Very expensive paper, that works perfectly. I started also using Arches Platine, which is pretty much a general purpose alternative imaging paper for any alternative imaging technique. But I found that I had one bad batch of that, and I started to get areas of gelatin that didn't settle properly. And I found that the Bockingford paper that I get in the UK is far cheaper and far better and far more reliable. So you don't need to spend a lot of money on your paper. I think pretty much any good quality watercolor paper will work, and it preferably about 300 grams just to give it some weight, and preferably not too smooth. It needs to have a little bit of a surface texture. If you want a more, well, I say a grainy type of image, then you can go into the cold press variety. That tends to be a little bit more of a chunky surface. So, I mean, Bockingford do hot press and cold press, and the only difference really is the texture of the surface. And I think pretty much the same with the Hahnemühle. But I certainly won't go back to Arches Platine because it was very expensive paper, and the one batch I got was pretty unreliable.
Can I ask another one for your digital negatives? I've been using that to make just silver gelatin prints, and I don't worry about the blacks on the negatives, but in other processes, UV lights and the correct color for blocking light.
I've tried different colored negatives. I've tried red ones, I've tried green ones, and the red ones do work fairly well, but I couldn't judge, if you like, the correct exposure visually with the red ones. So I've gone back almost exclusively now to normal black and white negatives.
It's impressive because your white's cleared really white.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
These are all. I mean, these are just normal inkjet negatives, and what I've found after a little bit of experience, you can judge. You don't need to mess about with your curves. You can judge the quality of your negative just visually, and what I tend to do, I mean, I'll probably have to do another little talk on how to do the negatives that work best for me. But what I find is that when I have a picture that I want to do a print of, I will, in Photoshop, I'll set the picture up as a positive on the screen, and I optimize the picture to perfection so that I like the picture on the screen for me and how I want it to be finally. And then all I do is the very simple way is to go into the contrast menu and just take a hell of a lot of contrast out. So I take out contrast probably about 3 times in Photoshop. So I take like 50 out, another 50, and then see how it looks. And as long as you've got detail in your highlights and your shadows, and your negative isn't too thick, if you know, I see what I mean. So as long as you don't, unless you particularly want a black to be white on your print, then you need to sort of try and get as much detail as possible and a fairly thin looking negative. So you go from the perfect print on screen to obviously invert it to a negative, and then you're taking out contrast to soften it. But I find the dichromate solution at 5% just gives me the right degree of contrast, if you like, for the paper to bring all the detail back where I want it. It doesn't work with every picture, so you may not get it to work for every print that you want, but most of the time you can, as long as you get your negative fairly thin with detail everywhere, and then what I've basically gone through today will give you a good print.
Nice. Thank you.
And Richard, I've been doing my digital negatives for Bromoil and just printing it out on paper, on like a luster paper, and that's been working great for contact prints for Bromoil. Have you used paper negatives?
Yeah, yes, I have. I think I tried it. I tried making a neg with beeswax. Well, making a paper print and then coating it with beeswax into a negative, and then yeah, that it was a lot softer. You working in that way, but yeah, I don't see why not at all.
What was the point of the beeswax?
Well, it makes the print transparent. So if you I mean, I'd never done it before. I mean, in all my life, I'd never made paper negatives until about a year ago. And I thought, well, my wife keeps bees, so I pinched some of her beeswax and started rubbing it. And I thought, I see how it works now. And then you're getting this like transparent looking print. And
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
It's creating, if you like, a softer grade of negative.
Sure. Yeah, any other questions before we wrap it up? All right, awesome. Yeah, you didn't leave much room for questions, man. You pretty much covered it from beginning to end. That was great. Well, Richard, thanks for putting this together, man. This has been really interesting. I'm excited to give this a try and you see what the process looks like. It seems so simple. It almost seems like cheating.
If you want any crib sheets, I'm happy to send anybody them. So if you want me to actually email anything, then I'm willing. So
awesome, thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and cut off the recording here.